I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. The Senate deciding on the Supreme Court nomination, the nation undecided, and an in-depth look at President Trump's wealth acquired long before he entered politics, in fact, even before he could walk or talk. It's cast renewed scrutiny on its family's business dealings. Investigative reporter Russ Buettner joins us, and later, Editorial Board member Mara Gay. She usually focuses on city and state politics, but this week her opinion page column was very personal. She described her own experience with sexual assault. Additional Times journalists bring their opinions to the fore on the backstory, and I'll add more on Coda. But first, Russ Buettner, who with Suzanne Craig and David Barstow have spent over a year examining the financial web of the Trump family. The result, their extraordinary investigation on how and when Donald Trump's inheritance began and grew, the financial ties that continued to bind the entire family. Russ, I guess the biggest question behind all of this, and there is a vast amount of information that's absolutely worth reading in the paper or online, is this avoidance or evasion of taxes?
It's a lot of both. There are instances certainly where they're just taking the structures that are allowed to wealthy people to pass wealth while minimizing their taxes, and they're sort of playing close within those boundaries, but then there's cases where they're just blowing those apart and being very aggressive in ways that appears intentionally deceptive, which can meet the legal standard for fraud. And then there are clearly other cases where it's not anything that is set up to formally allow wealthy people to avoid taxes. It's just a straight out sham corporation with no business purpose or an illegal tax write-off that washes away money and any kind of tax liability.
So are we talking about a father being nice to his son and a rich person doing everything he can within all the loopholes of the law, trying to keep his tax payments to a minimum? Or are we talking about someone who is being a crook and avoiding or evading taxes and subject to prosecution, theoretically?
Well, I'm pretty certain Fred Trump and Donald Trump thought it was the first, that it was just a good family taking care of each other. But the examples that we've uncovered really go more to the second. Can I give you an example?
Please do.
So they set up this thing called all-county building supply. Fred Trump had always bought everything for his properties himself. He ran a very small operation. He negotiated all the prices. In 1992, they set up this corporation, All County, that only existed on paper. Fred Trump continued to negotiate the prices. It's just that the invoices came on the letterhead of this company from his employee. And then that company, with that letterhead, there was a bill created for 20% more to Fred Trump. So Fred Trump was still paying the same price actually from the vendor, but this All County was adding 20% onto it, strictly on paper. And then that 20% was split between Donald Trump and his siblings. That's not something that's not a trust mechanism. That's not something that's in the tax code for the benefit of wealthy people. That's just straight out trying to create something that looks like something it's not. They perform no work and no services.
And even worse, some of that was passed on to the tenants.
Exactly. So you have to, for certain kinds of improvements to apartments, to rent regulated apartments, you have to file with the state and say, I put a new kitchen in this unit, it cost me $600, and I should be able to raise the rent by some factor based on this $600. But because they were submitting these padded bills, that $600 kitchen suddenly would be a $720 kitchen. And you multiply that times 10,000 units, you consider they were putting new boilers in, which cost $20,000 and $30,000 each. There were potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars of extra bills that resulted in artificially high rent increases to those apartments.
Russ, you and David and Suzanne spent over a year on this. Was all of this out of public records? What did you mine to find this information, as much as you could say?
Yeah, I mean, we followed sort of the usual process, which is you sort of scrape all the public records that you can. In this case, that was every property record on every Fred Trump building going back 60 years, deeds and mortgages, and some court records that were helpful. His sister's financial disclosure forms were helpful for us.
As a federal judge?
Yes, thank you. As a federal judge, that helped us sort of map out some of the categories initially. And then we sort of tried to create a network of sources of people who had worked in and around Fred Trump and Donald Trump spheres for a long time. And through that, we were able to gather quite a lot of records that were not public at all. More than 200 tax returns, Fred Trump's personal tax returns from his business entities, general ledgers from his business entities, bank statements, canceled checks, a variety of things that really helped us sort of collate all of this material into a cohesive story where we could really see where the money was flowing and when it was leaving that empire in ways that didn't seem straight up.
So when Donald Trump says that he started with a mere $1 million from his father, that's kind of duplicitous.
It's a profound fiction, is what it is. It simply never happened. I mean, he started receiving money from his father when he was 3 years old. His father built his first big housing project, Beach Haven, right away in 1949, gave the land under it to a trust that was controlled for the benefit of his then 5 children. Donald Trump was 3, and then Fred signed a 99-year lease with the trust to start paying it money. Donald Trump, from that point on, was collecting, at the time, the equivalent of a physician's salary. And then it just increased, and in Donald's darkest hours, President Trump's darkest hours in 1990, the 80s, when he was facing forced bankruptcies and foreclosures, the money increased greatly all throughout his life. It really was both the foundation that allowed him to do everything he did and bailed him out when all those things failed.
And is there still more that we don't know?
I think there's always more that we don't know. You know, we don't have his tax returns. We don't know what he really claims for other sources of wealth. And what we've got is the most comprehensive look, I think, that's ever been taken at this material. But there's always more you don't know.
Russ Buettner, thank you. And if you haven't already done so over the weekend, please read those articles online at nytimes.com. New York Times editorial board writer Mara Gay is next. Welcome back. Editorial board member Mara Gay's writing is focused mostly on state and city issues. This week she offered a very personal perspective of being assaulted and the aftermath of that rape. Her column began, "I was at my favorite bar recently, just a few blocks from my apartment, when the boy who raped me came over to say hello and gave me a kiss on the cheek." That's one column. You're going to read the rest of. Mara, why did you write that?
I wrote it because I felt that many friends and acquaintances who have been through similar experiences were suffering in silence, privately, with pain and shame that should not have been their own, and they were being re-traumatized by the hearing in which Dr. Ford testified for the Brett Kavanaugh nomination. And I think I felt like it was a personal form of catharsis, but even more than that, I saw Dr. Ford deliver what she described as her civic duty, and I felt a desire to put the burden of responsibility for sexual assault in the public sphere, where I believe it belongs, instead of, with victims.
How could you let this guy kiss you instead of strangling him?
No, it's a great question. I think that the man I was with, who's a very good friend of mine, had the same reaction, asked the same question. I think that as women, we are taught not to make a scene, and that we are taught to make others feel comfortable, to put our own needs second. And I have to say that this was, I believe, in that moment, I was shocked, first of all. Secondly, it was a form of self-defense and protection, which is available to women, which is, I'm not going to make a scene, I'm going to be polite, and I'm going to get out of here as quickly as possible. And then later, when my friend who I was with, who's a man, found out what was going on, he reacted in such anger. And I think that made me really rethink my own response as a woman and the way we're primed as women not to take our own pain seriously or validate it.
You wrote that part of that encounter was consensual. What did you mean?
Well, part of the sexual encounter that we had was sexual, and there were...
Was consensual.
I'm sorry, thank you. Part of the sexual encounter we had was consensual. I consented to some of it. I didn't consent to all of it. And I'll leave it at there with that. But I think, it's a distinction that actually is important because there is this sense of, there's a narrative around, well, in fact, I got an email from a reader, well, if you consented to some of it, then you're giving consent to whatever happens. And I think this is not 1950, and that's just not true, and our understanding of consent has changed. And so, a lot of people still need to be educated around those issues.
Well, what is the point at which people go too far? I mean, to me, listening to Dr. Ford's testimony, which sounded very credible, it sounded to me, and I'd love to hear your perspective, was assuming it was all true when Kavanaugh put his hand over his mouth and stopped her from saying no. Is that the moment that it becomes forced? I mean, how did you hear it?
Well, a couple of things. One of the things that Dr. Ford described, which was extremely disturbing to me, was, she was walking up the stairs, and as she tells it, she was grabbed, physically grabbed, pulled into a room by two men against her will, and then they, I believe, locked or shut the door on her and wouldn't let her out. So already you have, two instances of being physically violated. Her physical space was violated against her will and without her consent. And then after that, you have Dr. Ford telling us that Brett Kavanaugh ground his genitals against her. He did not, apparently, according to her, ask or seek consent for that. And then on top of it, in her account, you have, as you described, his hand over her mouth. So actually, you have a series of escalating, violations, I think is what I would say.
When do you give the benefit of the doubt? Bret Stephens has a column in the Times saying that he almost agrees with Trump being a bully because men or Brett Kavanaugh is being bullied in this case by so many people that no one is standing up for him when he denies all of this. And now you have an FBI report saying at least they can't substantiate it.
It's extremely frustrating to hear that because I think, first of all, you have the President of the United States standing up for Brett Kavanaugh, which is no small thing. The issue here is that we don't know what happened in that room. All we can do is judge, what is credible and what is and who is credible and who isn't. And I think Dr. Ford, I believe, is credible as a witness. I believe that her testimony is evidence. I think it should be counted as that. The thing is, this is not a court of law. And so there's a much higher standard, I think, for Brett Kavanaugh, or there should be, than if we were talking about putting him in prison for a crime. And, you're not entitled to a seat on the Supreme Court. And I think that for a lot of reasons, and namely the fact that he has lied about other things, maybe smaller things. For example, telling us that Brett Kavanaugh did things like, say that other witnesses had refuted Dr. Ford's testimony. That's not accurate. And that's a good example of, if you're telling a lie about that, what else are you lying about? He has all of the motive to lie or not be able to recall this incident, while Dr. Ford has no ostensible motive to do so.
Very quick last question. If the man you had an encounter with was nominated for the Supreme Court, what would you do?
I would name him.
Mara Gay of the New York Times, thanks for joining us. Please read her column online at nytimes.com if you haven't done so already. The backstory is next. Welcome back. Extraordinary week may be understating it, and joining me to examine it are my Times colleagues, contributing writers, and gurus, Clyde Haberman and Eleanor Randolph. Well, we saw a lot in the Times series on Donald Trump and his family and their taxes. What did we learn beside the fact that the family has very good accountants?
Oh, you learned that, maybe you already knew that Donald Trump was a con man, but what you really saw is that this guy, he didn't build an empire. He didn't take $1 million from his father and create, all these glorious apartment buildings and casinos that had trouble staying alive, and that his father was sort of feeding him money. My favorite part of it was when one of these casinos was about to go under. His father got somebody to buy $3.5 million worth of chips
Detail.
and just leave them on the table. So, what a contribution.
Yeah.
So.
This self-made man stuff. Jim Hightower, a Texas political type years ago, described the elder George Bush as having been born on third base, and he thinks he hit a triple. And that applies in spades to Donald Trump quite clearly. Yeah. So, no, it's also, the piece makes very clear that they play very fast and loose, to be very polite, with the law. And the Trumps always seem to feel that the rules don't apply to them. Even during the campaign, during one of the debates, when he was talking about not paying taxes, he said, well, that makes me smart. No, that makes you a chiseler. And if you believe, as I do, that Louis Brandeis got it right when he said that taxes are the price we pay for a civilized society, then this man is not part of our civilized society.
And there certainly seem to be cases, at least according to the report, where they cross the line between, into evading taxes from avoiding taxes.
Yes.
I thought one of the things I thought that was really interesting about Trump's response to this series. I mean, he said, okay, none of it's true, it's all fake news. That's expected. But his real point was that he thought it was, quote, boring, unquote. And that is a signal to, all his believers that this is really hard stuff. You don't want to get in. There's nothing to see here, really. This is dull, and it's a lot of paperwork and stuff like that. Don't worry about it.
Don't bother reading it.
Don't bother reading it.
Right.
It's hard,
Because if you read it, you might get a little angry of what I got away with.
That's right.
And
Or
something
try-
that you people can't do because you don't have that kind of money and you don't have those kind of
Tried
accountants.
to get away with. One of the things in that piece that I thought was really interesting was that that Trump tried to actually, when his father was, losing it and about to die, he tried to get this codicil in the will changed so that he got the money and not his siblings. And so, how much do you have to know about what a chiseler this guy is?
Also, one of his sister is a federal judge, and it sounds like she was, perhaps the piece suggested, that she may have knowingly been part of a phony operation in some of this stuff, including the codicil.
Well, she
and that's a
stopped the
little worrisome.
codicil.
She stopped it, but before that, there was some other rigmarole that she was involved in. But the obvious focus is Donald Trump himself, and Eleanor's right. The bottom line is all this self-made man stuff is just baloney, and that's a very polite word. He's had one failure after another, whether it was his casinos, whether it was his soccer league, whether it or football league, I could think it was.
Trump steaks,
Trump
water.
steaks, Trump wine.
Trump
all-
shuttle. On the other hand,
Trump
he
shuttle.
did get elected president.
Yes, he did, without getting, I have to emphasize, a plurality, let alone a majority of the popular vote. They can talk
he
about
won.
all, but he won. I mean, that's just a given. Our system is what it is. But he did not have the greatest victory in history, as he constantly tells his crowds, as I think he did the other night again in Mississippi. And by the way, Mississippi, there he is, mocking this woman who has a credible allegation of having been sexually assaulted. And these jerks are sitting behind her just laughing it up like it's the funniest damn thing since the Beverly Hillbillies. And it is outrageous. And that tells you, I'm afraid the only word that kept coming to my mind was deplorable.
Speaking of which, we are talking before the vote on Judge Kavanaugh. Have we learned anything from this experience, from the nomination process and the confirmation process?
Well, I think Clyde's right. I mean, that whole appearance in Mississippi was one of the most depressing things I've seen in a long time. I mean, okay, we don't expect, any diplomacy from Donald Trump anymore, but if you saw the people, especially there was a group of white males behind him. They were all just laughing and making fun of her. And of course, she said on the stand that one of the things that hurt her the most was the sound of the laughter, the people laughing at her. Here, they were just taking this forward. I can tell you, I don't know what's going to happen with Kavanaugh because that vote's going to be later, probably on Saturday. But if he's confirmed, I think you will see women by leagues and legions at the polls.
Voting what?
Well, I think they're going to have to vote Democratic. I don't see many Republicans who are moving to the other side at all. They're just quiet, basically.
Thanks to Clyde Haberman, Eleanor Randolph for joining me, and Coda coming up next. Did a colorful and conspicuous 6'5" bow-tied politician who wrote 18 books somehow fail to leave the impression he deserved on America's popular imagination? That's the question a Times reviewer says is posed by a new documentary titled Moynihan. It's a profile, of course, of the former UN ambassador and senator from New York, Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And in an era lacking in political heroes and long on cynicism, it's a film that's worth watching and one you should go see. You don't have to agree with everything Moynihan said or the bluntness with which he said it. But what a delight to be reminded of an unconventional, courageous, curious, commonsensical public official who not only wrote books, but read them. It was Moynihan who reminded us that everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but not to his own facts, who was prescient about the collapse of the Soviet Union and of the black two-parent family, who suggested that since we have a century's supply of handguns, why not restrict the sale of bullets? Moynihan embodied two characteristics missing in Congress today: a spirit of compromise and a sense of humor. He was first elected by challenging James Buckley, who repeatedly dismissed him as Professor Moynihan, to which Moynihan, who was indeed a professor, mused, "The mudslinging has begun." If he set that high a bar on campaign oratory, he also cautioned that society had become numb to antisocial behavior, that it had redefined deviancy to take for granted too much conduct that had previously been stigmatized. He warned that the issue of race had become so dangerously overheated that the rhetoric could benefit from a period of benign neglect. But the government still had the responsibility to confront the consequences of racism. Does not mean reducing efforts, he said, not at all, but it does mean trying to create some equivalence between what government can do about certain problems and how much attention it draws to them. He helped draft Lyndon Johnson's landmark speech at Howard University that unveiled an ambitious civil rights agenda and also a platform based on freedom of opportunity. And he later sounded this warning against cutbacks in welfare. In the 50 years since the Social Security Act was signed, we've never had a time that slowly but suddenly, with much greater force, the country is deciding that we're spending too much money on children. At the same time, though, he also cautioned that his own Democratic Party had, quote, rewarded the articulation of moral purpose more than the achievement of practical good. Moynihan also placed contemporary catastrophes in historical perspective. When President Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, the columnist Mary McGrory lamented what she called the end of Camelot. "We'll never laugh again," she said, to which Moynihan replied, "Heavens, Mary, of course we'll laugh again. It's just that we'll never be young again." For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.